All right, well, I think we can get started. So again, welcome everyone to our September meeting of the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. These meetings run from about 3:30 to 5:30, but really, as if you've attended in the past, we love open dialogue as we go. So please feel free to ask any sort of questions as we go through the process. Next slide, please. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to do a little bit of background on the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance. We're going to talk about some housekeeping issues and continuing education credits. There's credits available for both lawyers and technical staff as well. We're going to talk a little bit about the Midwest Cybersecurity Scholarship Program and corporate sponsorships. Then there are various other industry events that are happening, one in light of Cybersecurity Awareness Month of October, but various other events that are going on locally and around the country. And then we're going to dive into today's exciting topics. As I mentioned at the end, we always leave questions for the end, but we love them throughout because really this session is just a labor of love of all of us trying to figure out what our best practices in the cybersecurity and privacy space. So a little bit of background on the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance. This has been an organization that was formed really out of the goodness of all of our hearts, trying to figure out what to do in this space when there's not a lot of legal guidance, laws, and really it's just best practices and ethical frameworks. But we've been going for many years now. We are a nonprofit. We have many individuals today from the executive committee that will be speaking. But if you want more information about the organization, you can always go to this website here and sign up. It has all of our content from past sessions, and we've hit almost every single hot area in cybersecurity and privacy. So just wanted you to be aware of that. So now I'm going to turn it over just to do some housekeeping slides with Lisa.
Hi, everybody. This is just a notice of recording. We just want you to know that the audio and video is being recorded for playback and it will be distributed in a limited capacity. And by participating, we just want you to know that you consent to be included on the recording. And then here's some instructions for using Microsoft Teams. If everyone can mute their microphones and turn off their cameras until we open the program to questions, that will just enable the speakers to present without interruption. And we'll address audience questions at the end of the program or during. Click on the Show Conversation button to type your question into the chat box throughout the presentation, or you can use the Raise Your Hand button to unmute and ask your question live. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties with the webinar platform, refresh your browser or leave the meeting and rejoin. And then we also will be applying for continuing legal education credits in all applicable states. In order to get credit, you'll just need to fill out this attorney affirmation form and return it to me following the program or no later than October 4th. And this program may also be eligible for continuing privacy education credit. And we also have a link to the verification of attendance form for ISACA if you would like to self-report, and we'll also be putting that into the chat. And then if you have any other questions about CLE, please give me a call or shoot me an email.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa. So just as a reminder, Foley has a publicly available free state data breach notification chart. This deals with all the evolving state cybersecurity laws. We don't have one that updates all the privacy laws or all of the other laws around the world, but don't worry, we will be presenting on some of these hotter topics in the fall. And the way this chart works, and I've presented it many times, but you simply just Google, Foley's 50-state data breach chart. You click on the particular state you are interested in. And here's an example if you pull it up under Wisconsin. We just always like everybody to know this free resource that's available out there. So before I turn over Scott to go in the scholarship program, I just wanted to announce our next meeting is going to be November 16th. And we're going to talk about various things, but one of the main things HALOC's going to be hosting, and we're going to talk about forecasting threats. and how do you use threat sharing data to really, try to boil down where your next attack may occur. We likely are going to cover some of the SEC guidance that has come out as well. So stay tuned. It'll be in the follow-up materials, but I just wanted to let everybody know that the next meeting will be scheduled November 16th. And now I'm going to turn it over to Scott to do some background on our new scholarship program and corporate sponsorship.
All right, thanks, Jen. So welcome everybody to the MCSA meeting for this month. I'm Scott Owens. I'm a fairly new member of the board here. However, been involved in this group since its inception going back 6 years ago. And this group has evolved a lot over that time. Started with about 20 individuals, and now we've got almost 500 members officially, and our informational email goes out to well over 1,000 people on a regular basis. So it's a growing organization. We're seeing a lot of traction. To date, really what we've been focusing on over the past 5 years is having 5, 6, 7 informational sessions like this every year, where we bring in some experts to have a great conversation on relevant cybersecurity topics. But one of the things that we wanted to start in the upcoming years is a scholarship program. We recognize, like many of you probably do, that there is a very strong demand for cybersecurity talent, and the supply is just not there. And so we thought, as an organization that's deeply involved in the cybersecurity world, that one of the ways we can contribute to this is to launch a scholarship program. And what we'd like to do is to be able to award students right now we plan to start with universities in the Milwaukee area, Milwaukee School of Engineering, Marquette, and University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, to provide some scholarship money as they pursue cybersecurity disciplines. And each of those schools looks at their cybersecurity programs a little bit differently. But this is our intent, is to launch this for the 2022-2023 school year, which gives us about a year to finish our planning. We've already had some discussions with each of the universities and understand what it's going to require in order to make this a success. We want this program to be a pipeline, an opportunity, a resource for you, the member organizations here, as well as for the students to get a chance to get plugged in to get some mentoring through those of you that are here as part of this program. So a really great opportunity, I think, and so we're looking forward to this as we move forward. Next,
I just wanted to say one note, Scott, there is that for one who, if everybody could stay on mute, Teams is so fussy, even if you are not saying a word, it's got background noise. So if everybody could mute when you're not speaking. But thank you so much for Scott. I mean, to be honest, all of us have run this organization just as a labor of love, and we want to expand it, to try to do scholarships for the community. Try to get, students in particular interested in joining the cybersecurity workforce. And I just wanted to say thanks to all of you. And we would love to continue to have these sessions. Obviously, Foley always handles all of the background and does all the invites and hosts them. We will go back to in person, hopefully in January, but we would just love to get you and your organization further involved. And so on that note, Scott, if you want to talk about the corporate sponsorships.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on a side, I see that Allison just put my contact information in the chat. So if you want more information about the scholarship program or the corporate sponsorships that I'm about to talk about here, please reach out to me, as I'll be coordinating a lot of this. So, one of the things that, being able to provide scholarships and being able to continue to provide resources and meetings of the caliber that we have is that we need some financial support. It's been an all volunteer organization to this point, which has been great, and we've got a long way so far. But we're looking to grow in a number of different areas. And so we are introducing some opportunities for corporations to become sponsors. And we've got these listed on the screens. your sponsorship level will enable you to have certain benefits as part of this, but largely, a good chunk of this money that we would incorporate as part of these sponsorship levels would be earmarked to go to student scholarships. And I mentioned on the other slide that we'd like to be able to offer, $1,000 to a number of different students, maybe, and that would be on an annual basis. And maybe that number changes depending on how well this is going. I would tell you that we already have 3 organizations that have committed to being partners with the organization, with MCSA, just in some of our preliminary conversations, and we'd like to open this up to all of you as an opportunity. We have a goal of seeding our scholarship program with $50,000 by the end of the year to enable us to really get this program off the ground. And so that's a tall goal, but I think there's a lot of great organizations in this area that could benefit from the students and the interaction, and be in a position to provide the mentoring. And so what you see on the screen here are some opportunities to get plugged in and to help support what we are doing to further the cybersecurity discipline in southeastern Wisconsin and the Midwest area. So please contact me if you have questions or would be in a position to assist, or your companies would be in a position to help us out with some of that. And lastly, I would say, as a tie-in to this, I would just want to introduce Tina Chang coming up next. Tina is the CEO of SysLogic, and they are putting on, in addition to being the sponsors for today's meeting and leading the presentation that's coming up with Bryce, SysLogic is planning to have a cybersecurity summit. If you all haven't seen this or know about it, it's an absolutely fantastic event this year, planned for October 7th, live in person at MSOE in a really fantastic brand new venue, beautiful place. And at this summit, you get to hear some great panelists on current topics of cybersecurity of this time. And also, Tina has graciously agreed to donate some of the proceeds from this event to help start our scholarship fund. And so we have a debt of gratitude to Tina and her team there. But I'm going to hand this off to Tina let her talk about this summit, and then we'll be on to our presentation for the day.
Wonderful. Scott, thank you so much for that intro. I think you said a lot. To bring a little bit more color to this, as Jen said, October is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And we started this summit a handful of years ago in order to bring a local focus on some of the trends here in Wisconsin and beyond, but most importantly, to also help our local cyber experts connect with each other. It's one of the reasons why we are doing this event in person. We're going to hope that nothing thwarts us between now and October 7th. We will be gathering in the afternoon in person, as Scott mentioned, in the beautiful Dierks Hall at Milwaukee School of Engineering in downtown Milwaukee. Thank you to MSOE as our host location sponsor. And you'll be greeted with a great lineup of security experts across various industries, including Children's, Abbott Labs, Kohl's, Johnson Controls, and MSOE. You'll also have an opportunity to meet our security organizations here in the state. Of course, Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance will be there. So you'll have a chance to network and meet in person many of the leaders that you see here today on the event, as well as InfraGard Milwaukee, the Marquette University Center for Cybersecurity Awareness organization, as well as the Cyber Defense as well as ISAC Milwaukee chapter. As Scott mentioned, there is a $50 fee, but not just the profits. Every single dollar goes to the scholarship fund. So while connecting with your friends, getting the opportunity to meet and greet, getting a cocktail or two during the reception session from 5 to 6:30, or donating to the scholarship fund, I think that you will have multiple wins. We are going to limit the attendance to 150 people just so we have some elbow room, and a QR code, and we will show this again toward the end, is available as well as the URL if you're interested in registering. With that, Jen, I will turn it back over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Tina. And honestly, totally appreciate you guys doing your own event to our scholarship fund, because this is a new thing for us and we're trying to raise money to not only educate all of us, but educate the next generation of cybersecurity and privacy specialists. So thank you. I want to talk now just about some other events. And I'm not sure if she's on or not, but a good friend of mine who is the president of ASQ, I was out with her last week and she said, I would love to offer your group another discount about an event that we're doing. They have a huge Quality 4.0 Summit. This is October 25th through the 27th. If you're doing any sort of projects, hello, Anne, I see you in the chat. If you're doing any sort of projects around data transformation, and I know many of you are, because either you have reached out to me or your C-suite or board or your marketing department wants to learn about data transformation. Anyway, here is the information here as well. These slides will be going out to you. Obviously, if you have any questions, you can reach out to us, and I will also forward on to Anne any sort of request. But really an awesome summit with a $200 discount, and here's a specialty code here. So a couple other events, I'm just going to announce one, and then Jerry, the individual that did not have himself on mute, I'm just kidding, Jerry, I'm teasing you, actually reached out to me earlier today about a summit. But we also have the International Association of Privacy Professionals, big summit this year out in San Diego. You know, I don't know if I'm going to go in person or attend, but there's lots of privacy law development. So if anybody's interested in that, that's PSR towards the end of October. I wanted you all to be aware. And then Jerry, if you're on screen, I'll mute, but there's also the annual Wisconsin Governors Cybersecurity Summit. I put a little blurb in the chat box here, but Jerry, I don't know if you have anything else to say about that as well.
A little bit. This year, I've been in contact with Don Zanoni, and we're actually going to be there also, and I'll have a small range set up for those that want to go. It's been expanded into the morning on the second day. They found that, you know, there's just too much content. And the nice thing that I'm looking at the agenda again is they're giving you more opportunities to actually attend the breakouts. In other words, you don't have to pick and choose between two of them. You can try and catch one. So that's a really nice gesture on their part. It's at the Wilderness Lodge. For those who've been there, the conference center is really nice, and they always have a good selection of topics that are relevant to what we're seeing today. And
well, that's wonderful. Well, thank you, Jerry. We appreciate it. If anybody wants more information, we just go to this link. Before I start the program, I don't know if anybody else is on the line. If anybody has any other local or national or global meetings they want to announce, please feel free to jump on. All right. Well, thank you all. If you think of anything, please feel free to share it through the chat box. So now I am so excited to talk about this topic today. And, you know, we really took a lot of time to think through some of these evolving issues because, you know, our sessions, we've covered so many different things over the years, and we really want to hit hot topics. And today we're really going to talk about security testing, and we're going to talk about it not just from a technical security perspective, but also from a legal and a risk and a compliance perspective. And for the lawyers on the call, more and more security testing is coming into our space, and I'll tell you where and how. You know, when we do due diligence, you know, for deals, we look a lot at, you know, what is the most recent security testing was done? What are the results of that security testing to really help us evaluate risk of buying a potential company? We also definitely post-breach regulators are very familiar with types of security testings as well, and literally get into the weeds of I want your pen test results. Now, turning it over to regulators is a different story for a different day, but certainly the community, both legal risk and compliance, in addition to technical specialists, need to know more about what is security testing and really how does it enhance your program. So I am so excited that we're talking about this topic today. And I also want to thank again our sponsors from SysLogic. Obviously, Tina and Bryce, our speaker today. We just really appreciate all of your support and your support of our scholarship fund. And now I am going to turn it over to Bryce to take it away. But I'm going to ask questions throughout. And when we're in person, which we will be again, probably not in November, but January for sure, cross our fingers. Please ask questions as we go. Really, it's for all of us to learn, and no question is stupid. So either jump in the chat box, raise your hand, jump in, and we'll leave time at the end as well for questions. So take it away, Bryce.
Thanks, Jen. I will take control here. Okay, great. Appreciate that. I'm going to slide up to a little bit about me for those. I know I've met some of you, and but we've got a lot of people on here that I know I have not met. So to give you a little background, I work for SysLogic, local technology firm. Although I'm not local, I'm based in Los Angeles at the moment. And but my background is in software development, last 22 years or so, and then that led into a cybersecurity focused career. I lead a team of security consultants at SysLogic, and we do a variety of different services, as most consulting teams do. But two of our core areas of expertise, or core areas of business, if you will, is around pen testing or cybersecurity testing as a whole. So this is definitely a topic of interest and what I'm involved with day to day. We do not just and I'll talk more about different types of testing, but not just traditional enterprise network pen testing, but all sorts of pen testing, from commercial products to mobile applications and cloud hosted systems and everything in between, physical devices. We'll talk a bit more about that, and have an opportunity to work with everything from very small firms to very large Fortune 500 global organizations, and they often have large in-house development teams and engineering. So I'd given a flavor of this discussion before to a hacker conference in New York, but that was very technical, and we got into the weeds of things. We felt like this would be a good topic to have to a broader audience. There are some technical kind of components of this, but I'm going to stay at a higher level, and please feel free to ask questions. We want this to be interactive, and make sure that you're able to get something out of this, and hopefully you can see the applicability to what you do. So let's start off with, what is cybersecurity testing? This probably is very familiar to many of you. It comes into play with these two questions. How confident are you about your overall security posture? And then how can you really know? And that's where we feel that testing comes into play. It validates that you have security controls and that they're working correctly. This is a really important aspect. It's, you can have a really great investment in, products, tools, people, procedure, and policy, but if you never test them, it's hard to know how well they're serving you. So that's what we're going to speak to as part of this discussion. So I want to talk a bit about cybersecurity testing and the different types that you see here. This is not an exhaustive list. This is not, it's in alphabetical order. So there's, various ways you could look at this. These terms there's a bit of overlap. And in fact, there's, the term pen testing in and of itself is very overloaded. It means different things to different people. So we always like to clarify especially with a new client, what does that mean to you? And let's talk about what sort of activities should be involved, what the scope should look like, et cetera. But let's look at these in more detail. So audit, you may have heard, obviously, many of us are probably familiar with the term audit. And as it relates to cybersecurity, this usually means a focus on regulatory compliance, whether that's PCI DSS for e-commerce or HIPAA in the healthcare arena. And again, this may not necessarily mean an outside auditors coming in. It might be an internal audit. There's many different variations of this. Bug bounties allow people to attack your systems, and then you pay them for finding vulnerabilities. Again, this has different flavors of it. Not all organizations, well, I should say not all. There's less organizations that perform some sort of bug bounty program than they do these other things, and that's for good reason. It's we'll talk a little bit more about bug bounties later, so I don't want to spend too much time on it now. Gap analysis. This assesses the security maturity of your organization against target goals. That's usually the key with any sort of gap analysis. It's looking at a current state and some sort of target state and identifying the gaps between, how do you get to that point? How do you mature your organization and your security program? Penetration tests. This is an area where my team does a lot of work in. It's around finding weaknesses and exploits within a target system, but the key component of this is the manual aspect. We'll talk about some of these others, but that's usually pen testing. Generally, like the general consensus, if you were to talk with other cybersecurity firms and those that perform pen testing, we would say we differentiate penetration testing because of the manual component that's associated with it, humans performing testing. Red teaming, this is a term that's a little bit newer, but used by many firms too. It talks about pen testing, but usually it's more involved. It's larger teams. There's more interaction between different groups within an organization. So it's usually more holistic and involving just a wider swath of people, both inside and outside of an organization. A risk assessment. This is all around identifying, estimating, and prioritizing organizational risk. This again can take many different forms, and there's often an overlap. Like it's not uncommon to see a flavor of a risk assessment and gap analysis kind of go hand in hand. Threat hunting. This is another fairly common form of activity, especially in large organizations where you've got security professionals who are dedicated to searching for, logging, monitoring, and neutralizing threats before they can cause serious problems. So the focus is on the threats. It's, in other words, attackers or maybe malware, certain flavors of malware and how they work and looking for them and so forth, as opposed to the next one, vulnerability assessment, is really focused more on identifying weaknesses, identifying vulnerabilities. They may not directly be exploitable, meaning you can't, in and of its current form, cause something, cause a bad impact to the system. But you start chaining those together, those weaknesses, or apply some other, maybe if a firewall port were opened, then those vulnerabilities become a really big deal. It's things like that. So the main difference in general, again, I'm kind of looking at this at a more generic level, but the vulnerability assessment, that is more of an automated process. In other words, there's more focus on automation as opposed to penetration testing, where there's generally also automation, but there's usually a manual focus as well. So where does testing fit into the overall picture? You might be familiar with the NIST CSF, or Cybersecurity Framework. This slide attempts to show, the different high-level functions of it broken down in these different colors. And really what I'm trying to show here is that testing fits in at many different areas. I picked just 3 or 4 here to identify, or to show that there are key components within the identify area to, asset vulnerabilities are identified and documented, threats are identified and documented. Within the detect realm of functions, detection processes are tested. If you were to go through NIST CSF, which is one of many, cybersecurity frameworks and methodologies, but there are many areas where you'll find either it being directly called out in some form of testing, or something around, risk assessment or some other flavor that might not sound like testing at first, but it's really, if you were to look at the large umbrella of everything that could be considered testing, then yeah, it comes up a lot. So as part of this discussion, I'm certainly pulling from a lot of history and information that SysLogic has gathered over the last decade. We've looked at many different types of systems, like I mentioned earlier, many different industry verticals, hundreds of millions of lines of source code, In fact, my team is working on a system right now that's, I think, 22 million lines of source code. So we spent a lot of time in code, as well as looking at, systems in their, runtime state where we don't necessarily have access, detailed access to code. But some of this discussion is going to kind of dive many levels deep, just so you can see the full picture of where weaknesses lie. It's not just on the outside, the perimeter layers of things. There are weaknesses potentially at every layer, and want to talk about what those look like, where automation comes into play as opposed to that human element. Also, I'm going to leverage data from industry standard organizations like NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, and other public data sets. Firms like us, for example, that do a lot of this work. We tend to share information at kind of a high level just to kind of get a feel for what we're seeing from our point of view when it comes to either commercial applications or systems that are out there. One particular information source I want to highlight it's called the OWASP ASVS, or Application Security Verification Standard. It's designed primarily for software engineers, as well as those designing, developing, implementing software, but there's a lot to it, and it's a really good granular standard for identifying what is considered secure. You may be accustomed to working with standards from NIST and others that talk about internal enterprise organizations and standards that they have to ideally should maintain, or best practices. ASVS is somewhat unique in that its focus is on those that are creating software and components that use software, mobile applications, for example, or IoT devices. So I believe there's like 288 controls currently in here, and like I said, it's very granular. It goes into a lot of detail. It's an example of a source that we use, a standard that we can point to and say, we found a weakness, and we are able to state it's a weakness based on the information and guidance that an organization like OWASP has put together in this particular standard. So here's an interesting statistics. A few months ago, we kind of analyzed most of our pen tests to date, and we found that on average, almost half of the vulnerabilities that we discovered were found through manual efforts. This was a little surprising. We knew that there was a fair amount of our findings that were more manual in nature, and we wanted to, put some data against this to look at what does that really look like. We also noticed that the manual findings, the ones that we reported that we determined were found through manual means, in general had a higher average severity, meaning they were typically more concerning. We also found, and this is not too surprising, but systems like embedded or IoT devices generally is where we found more findings of a manual nature. That kind of makes sense. Existing tooling is still maturing when it comes to IoT devices and scanning of those systems. We also found that systems that were more mature, or organizations that were generally more mature from their security program, they usually, if things were in a place where we didn't find as many security weaknesses as a result of automated scanning. So that's where we tended to find more things from a manual nature. In other words, we would go deeper or go up to the next level in order to determine things that maybe tools could not find. So nothing too surprising here, I think, but it is interesting that this 46% I think is not too uncommon. In fact, I'll get to another slide here where we see that kind of resonated, or actually in the previous slide with ASVS. I kind of skipped over that, but you notice here this quote: automated tools and online scans are unable to complete more than half of the ASVS without human assistance. So that was something that's called out as part of the standard. Of those 288 controls, many of them that are determined, or it is determined that they can be found through automation, through tools, but there's many that cannot. And so that seems to have been, that's borne true in our testing over many systems. That being said, we are always looking for ways to automate more. We don't want to rely on just humans. anytime we can, script something or automate it, we will certainly look at that. But that being said, I'll talk more about specific examples where that may be either challenging or impossible. So this chart, a little bit of a heat map, if you will, but or just a breakdown tree map, I guess. It is looking at our findings over the last decade and giving you a certain percentage. So on average, overall, what did we see? We saw that the third party or vulnerabilities in third party, and I'll talk more about third party and open source, but that is one area where we saw, in general, the largest amount of findings. And that's not too uncommon if you think about the fact that more and more software and systems these days are built on open source. So the more open source you use, the more opportunity there is for vulnerabilities to be present in that open source.
And third parties also cause many data breaches as well. So they go hand in hand.
Yep. So we try and spend as much time with the third part. Well, we use different approaches, and I'll talk more about that. But third party is definitely in scope, just because there is so much. I mean, the statistics will vary, but I've heard something recently like 70% of all of software involved in modern systems is open source. So 70-30, and it's kind of vary obviously, but something like in that range. And then of that 70%, something like 90% of those libraries will often have one or more vulnerabilities associated with them, which is pretty crazy to think about. Like a large portion of any system that you look at probably has vulnerabilities buried away just in the open source portion of it. Now, they may not all be exploitable, and that's a key point that I'll get to, but they're just there. They're just waiting for something to happen. One thing I will highlight too that's really important to consider with any tool or any pen testing firm and any testing firm in general is that anytime you see a lot of findings of a certain category, a certain type, that's usually a good indication that that's what that tool is good at. And all tools have a bias, if you will, where they're better at finding certain things than they are others. And so as a result, you will see more of a certain type of finding than others. That's why some tools do things better than others in certain areas. The same thing is somewhat true with manual teams, pen testing firms. We constantly kind of check ourselves and look at the data like this to say, okay, are all of our reports have a high percentage of, say, communications findings? That may be good, but it may mean we're missing other things. So definitely look at any kind of reports that you get or output to hopefully see that there's some even distribution there, or at least that there aren't areas or gaps that are never being addressed. All right, so next let's look at different types of tools. There's a bunch of acronyms in here, but don't let that dissuade you. You really don't have to know about what these tools are necessarily. Obviously, we do, my team and teams like ours, we have to know what these are, but I wanted to give you a little bit of insight into the world of testing and where tools like this fit into the picture. So we've got something called static application security testing, or SAST. This is the analysis of software without actually executing the programs. So, you give us the raw source code, we don't build it necessarily, we might, but we don't build it, we don't run it, we just run tools against it and see if it can find problems within the source code in that kind of raw form. This could be as simple as grep-like tools, which, in other words, just searching for keywords through source code, especially if you've got, 20 million lines of code, you're going to be doing some searching for keywords through it because that's relatively fast as opposed to slower tools. This doesn't necessarily involve just source code. It could be binaries, it could be mobile packages, container images. If these days with containerized systems, Kubernetes systems, you've got more and more things that look a little different than they have in the past, but they're still just another way of distributing and packaging software, firmware images, etc. I'll highlight a few, I see these logos here. These are just examples of open source tools for those that if you may have heard, for example, of SonarQube before. That's where it fits into the picture. It does other things too, but at least from the standpoint of security testing, it falls into this static application security testing space. Next, we have software composition analysis, or SCA. These tools are designed for open source. So third party, you could say, but primarily open source is where they shine. They examine the software to determine the origins of all components within the software. And they have various ways in which they do this. They might look at package references or tear apart a binary. But ultimately, they're trying to determine what is all the open source that's used? What are the versions of that open source? Maybe what is the licensing associated with that open source? That can be a big concern if you're using less permissive licenses in commercial products. That's generally frowned on. So what's unique about SCA tools is they're not looking for vulnerabilities in code. They're just doing asset identification at a software level, software component level, and saying, oh, that's this particular open source library. I have a database I can refer to of all the published vulnerabilities. And so as a result, I can get you that information. So it's not looking for any new vulnerabilities that haven't been found before. And anything that it's find has already been known, already been published. There's hopefully already a patch or upgrade available for it. So these tools, very complementary to the static, the SAS tools. Next, we have the dynamic flavor, the dynamic application security testing. This typically refers to testing of web applications and APIs. It doesn't have to be HTTP-based testing, but that's usually where these come into play. And it usually implies, testing it against the running system, a production or production-like environment. This is the type of testing that generally occurs within like an enterprise environment, for example, an enterprise network. You're not going to be presenting us necessarily with software. We're not going to get down to that level where we're looking at code, but we're going to be scanning through an entire network and assets and effectively doing dynamic application security testing. So this uses many of the same techniques an attacker would to find potential weaknesses. What's unique about DAS is it doesn't have an internal view. It doesn't have access to source code. It really doesn't know. It has limited knowledge about how things work behind the scenes. It's just looking at whatever layer you're able to point it at. And then the last one is interactive application security testing, or IAST. This they use a combination of static and dynamic analysis techniques. They can test whether known vulnerabilities in code are exploitable in the running application. So it's interesting in that it uses knowledge. So it kind of has to be embedded within the application that you're testing, use instrumentation and other kind of fun sort of ways to hook into the application at runtime so that it can see data as it flows through the system and through the application, and other sort of advanced attack scenarios. Again, makes it a very useful sort of tool when you have the ability to set all that up and scan at that deep of a level. So a little bit about where tools do well. Things like memory safety, insecure string and integer handling. These are things that are pretty easy to highlight. You could find very quickly within code and say, oh, that's a problem because you should never do it that way. It'll cause this particular issue. A common web application.
Bryce, this is Jen. So just to interject for us, lawyers and not deep in the technical weeds, when do you recommend to do these types of testing? I'm sure it varies, but I think for those of us that are looking at testing from a holistic perspective when we're advising on developing a cybersecurity program, or we're in-house and we're talking to our technical colleagues, when should this testing be done, typically speaking? I'm sure it's ongoing, but that would be helpful for those of us that, want to understand when they should come into the ecosystem.
Sure. Yeah, great question. For us, it tends to look a little differently if we're looking at an organization's environment. So their network, their assets, what their employees are using. That typically occurs where either like on a 6-month or annual basis, and often aligned with some other sort of risk assessment or gap analysis where we may come in to perform the more technical testing component of that. And that tends to be not quite as deep, doing a bit of automation. We try and keep everything in scope. In other words, all internal IP assets, all your external internet-facing landscape, whatever that looks like. When it comes to the other side that we spend a lot of time in, that's with commercial product development. And then, of course, usually we're involved is every major release of a product, or really anything that's customer facing. That's where there might be some flavor of testing that gets deeper. So it's looking more not only at the front end, what the customer sees, but also the back end systems. How is that data flowing? How is it being protected? How is the new versions of the application being deployed, and so forth. Great question, though. And anyone else, yeah, feel free to ask questions at any point.
Thanks, that was helpful.
Some common misunderstandings. I've seen these time and time again. Like, one good security tool can do it all. And there are some tools that incorporate everything I talked about, static analysis, SCA, and so forth. That can be pretty pricey, but they do exist, or at least, there's a vendor that will sell you a suite of different tools. Rarely do I see, one tool or even a whole suite of tools from one vendor being everything that an organization needs, unless they're fairly small, I suppose. But there are reasons why there are so many tools out there, and they all kind of do things, they have their pros and cons. And so it's pretty rare. Like, if you've invested in one particular tool or tool suite, just be aware that's generally not always going to provide everything you need. But at the same time, I'm not saying you should spend more money, because higher cost doesn't necessarily mean better results. It's often better to get a lower cost tool and really understand how to use it, or have people that understand how to use it well, versus purchasing a more expensive tool or system that is more hands-off and no one really knows how to use it or configure it correctly. Often these sort of systems, these testing tools, need to be used by someone with at least some experience, some training. There are a few that are designed to be used by people with very little security experience, but the problem it's usually like easy to run them, but then it's very difficult to work with the results. In fact, there's just the bottom right bullet here is the results. The misconception is that results are generally understood by IT staff or software engineers. And we work with IT staff and software engineers daily, kind of having reviews of the findings. And we find that it's often very difficult. More often than not, we have to translate the results from tools into, group things together, provide specific guidance, because the raw tool output sometimes can be very confusing. It can be contradictory, very interesting. There's also a misconception that you want zero false positives. I know some vendors tout this as their claim to fame. We have zero false positives. That can mean a good thing in certain contexts, but you generally don't always want zero false positives. It can depend. My team definitely wants to see some false positives, because we don't want to hide anything. And that's the problem. If there's no false positives, you might be missing something that can clue you into a problem. And of course, the tools can replace people. At the end of the day, and we'll talk more about this, there will most often always be an area where you need humans to perform that level of testing.
Okay, it's time to announce CLE code number 1. Please record this code on your attorney affirmation form and send that completed form to me following the program. And the first code is Q as in quick, Z as in zebra, N as in Nancy, U as in umbrella, and K as in kite. Again, that's Q, Z, N, U, K. And Bryce, I just grabbed control back of the slide, so if you want to take control and advance, or I can do that for you.
Sure, will do. Thanks. All right, so next let's look at some examples where tools don't always do what they need to, or at least where we find we get as much as we can out of them, but they can't do certain things very well. So I kind of wrapped up the last discussion about false positives. Let's talk a little bit more about that on this slide. So what do we mean when we say a false positive? It's basically in other words, referred to as a type 1 error, where we have identified something, but it is not correct. So we've identified a problem, something negative in nature, but that identification is not correct. So certain tools do this really badly. In fact, they're almost useless because you get so much noise out of them that it takes way too much time to sift through that to figure out if any of it is valid. So it's just easier to throw out the whole batch. So that's the biggest concern with false positives. Is that there's just too many. You want to keep that number low, or at least have some process to manage it. So, a tool is only as valuable, or it's only valuable if you have a process or some sort of team to sift through that noise and follow through on addressing any weaknesses identified. We time and time again see systems where a tool is run, the output is produced, and it's just kind of set on a shelf, so they can check a box saying, yes, we ran the scannings, we got the results, here's the results in case anyone wants to look at them, but that's all we're doing. We're not really spending any time reviewing results or acting on them. Oops, I skipped a slide. Poor architecture choices. This comes up a lot, and it's near impossible, in my opinion, for a tool to determine where there are certain design flaws. They have a hard time getting sufficient context to point this out. So one example, many applications use custom implementations of what we call identity or authentication services, effectively the login process. They kind of recreate that wheel every time, where we recommend that why do that? It's so error prone when they're custom made. We would rather see you use something pre-made as a software developer, or leveraging something common even within an organization, have everyone sign in via their corporate credentials, as opposed to using, application specific user accounts. Not only does that make it more convenient, but it also helps you centralize that security control in your most robust system. Hopefully your login system, your single sign-on system has the most security associated with it. So this is one area. Poor architecture choices or design flaws is something tools have a really difficult problem or difficult challenge with. Another area is with administrative access control. How does a security tool know what is admin level functionality? And this is a good example of where tools they can't think like a human does. They can look at things based on rules that you define, but ultimately they can't tell unless you give them some insight. Should a user in this system be able to access details of other users in the system? In other words, is that common for most users in this system? Should that sort of functionality be only limited to administrators? That's something that, and when it gets into the weeds of actually running the tools and interpreting the results, most tools don't even try. That's not something they're going to look for, because there's no way for them to automatically determine what is administrative functionality versus what isn't. Even for authorization implementations that are implemented well, often we've found that if we poke deep enough, we might be able to find some flaw in it. In other words, we may be able to change our own role or upgrade our own permissions so that we have more rights or more abilities than we should. Even in systems where you would kind of assume, oh, well, I'm leveraging some authorization system that it comes with. Surely they've done that correctly. Maybe not. I wouldn't rely on that.
From a legal perspective, Bryce, this is where we see tons of hacks occur, because, you get a third party in your system, and if they can upgrade their roles or permissions, then it's so when we review this, post forensically, this is incredibly important. In particular with ransomware, I would say as well, is
Sure.
this ability.
Right. And this is another good reason why, as much as possible, you want to have your systems leverage your strongest, most robust identity and access control system, which is what, single sign-on sort of implementations. Whereas if you're relying on whatever the particular system offers, it generally is going to be weaker, not always, but it's very possible that it's likely weaker than whatever your enterprise solution would be. Business logic attacks. Tools can help replicate things like bots and automation attacks, but they need you to guide them on what's considered unacceptable activity if it's either done too quickly or out of sequence. So in this example, this is kind of a classic one we use where we have an IoT device and it needs to be upgraded. It's firmware upgraded. The attacker in this scenario has physical access to the device where they can, insert a USB flash drive or SD card that has a valid, legitimate firmware upgrade on it. So they start with, legitimate software, they insert it, the IoT device validates it because it's assigned and that it says, okay, that's a legitimate firmware upgrade. But then it pauses and it prompts the user to continue. Basically says, okay, are you sure you want to upgrade the system? The attacker takes advantage of that pause and replaces the USB drive or SD card with a different image that hasn't been validated, and then clicks the continue, and then the upgrade process occurs at that point, not even thinking about the fact that the attacker might have swapped the image that was just validated with one that's not validated. And this sort of attack is sometimes referred to as time of use versus, or time of check versus time of use attack. Here we call it business logic, but it's really hard to test for unless you know the system well and you can think like an attacker through the various steps and understand where there may be a deviation in the process that you have to put in some additional validation for or additional checks to prevent that from happening. As a result, we like to have people on the team that really think like, what is the most bizarre thing you could do with this system just to see what will happen. Another area where tools have trouble with is this, what's called an insecure direct object reference, or IDOR. Has a really a bit confusing name if you're not sure, if you've never heard of this before, but it's pretty simple in concept. It's a type of access control vulnerability where an application or system leverages users' applied input to access objects without verification. So normally they're supposed to verify, anything the user gives them, but often, depending on how the application is constructed, they make assumptions about what the user is providing is probably legitimate because maybe it's coming from the web application and they don't think about the fact that an attacker can bypass the web application and go directly to the back end. So there may be an API endpoint, effectively a URL on the back end that receives an ID number. And we always kind of tamper with those parameters just to see what will happen. Can we change that number manually, either by editing HTTP traffic or some other means, and just to see what will happen? Are we then able to access data for another customer or data for another user? And often we will find weaknesses with this. And again, this is something, a tool, it can definitely fuzz those parameters. In other words, try different combinations, but it doesn't know how to interpret the results necessarily. It doesn't know, oh, now I'm getting data for a different user than the original data. In some scenarios it can, but this is just an example of an area where tools are challenged. Misuse of cryptography. Yeah, we spent a lot of time with cryptography implementations. It is a confusing topic, even for software engineers who, have a really strong grasp on programming concepts. They may have very little training or experience on cryptography. And often we see the copy and paste methodology of making it work. You go out to the internet, you find something that looks like what you need, you paste it in your application, and if it works, you move on. The problem is this is an area that's a little bit dangerous. Just because it works doesn't mean that it's done correctly. And often there's very subtle weaknesses in cryptography. For example, it's easy to say, don't use a certain cipher because it's old and broken. But what we see more often, at least for what we look at, is where the wrong tool is used for a job. For example, reversible encryption is used to store user account passwords, which really should never be done, but it's very common. So it's something we can fairly easily highlight, but again, where it would be difficult for a tool to find it because if it's just looking at code or a particular database, which is rare that a tool would do that. But if it's looking at code, it says, oh, encryption, these ciphers are ones I recognize and they're new and modern and so forth, they're used correctly, but it can't tell, it doesn't really know your intent. It doesn't know, oh, you're trying to store passwords in a secure form. Tools are also poor at telling you when encryption keys are not being stored securely or they're being reused between environments or devices. That's a big one. Often, you can test something in isolation and you can see a key or certificate used and think, okay, that's good. But if you don't have the context about how it's being used else, how or if it's being used elsewhere, that could introduce a weakness as well. Especially, we see this often with commercial products where they are shipped with a common certificate or a common key. And the concern there is, they could do a great job protecting it, but if an attack were to compromise just one of those devices, they could potentially compromise all of the devices that they have access to. Here's one example from an actual pen test we did, where there's something called HTML5 local storage, which is what a browser uses to store data that it receives locally from websites that you interface with. Generally, more web applications that you'd log into, do some activity, and log out. So local storage is it's not designed for sensitive data because it persists after the user logs out of the system. So our guidance is don't put anything sensitive in there. If you're using a shared computer, like at a hotel, for example, that data will still exist locally on that computer. And so don't store anything as a web application developer. Don't put anything sensitive in local storage. So we reported this back to the team. They said, okay. And a few months later, or a year later, I don't remember now, we ran another pen test in the same system to see changes that they've made and realized that they had addressed this, but they didn't move it out of local storage like we said. They just encrypted it and put a static encryption key into a JavaScript file, which if you know anything about JavaScript, those always, they get served to the browser. They're accessible to anyone that accesses the website if you know where to look. So they followed our advice by making it worse effectively. Credential recovery, I'll just skim through this, but there is good guidance out there. Like OWASP has something called the Forgot Password Cheat Sheet. Anytime you go through, you take advantage of like, did you forget your password feature on a web application, or really doesn't have to be a web application, any system. There's a set of procedures that must be met, I should say, in order to keep it secure. It's not an easy thing to implement correctly. There are many things to keep in mind with a forgot password workflow. And what's interesting is, we do a lot of testing with these workflows, and we find that tools can probably, detect some of these weaknesses, but most generally don't, or it might be really difficult for them to detect all of these sort of checks are in place. So as a result, we often have to go through this manually, just choosing that we forgot our password, getting the email or whatever token, and just kind of walk through that process and see, did they meet all of these specific requirements in order for it to be considered a secure system. And it's getting, I think in general, things are getting better only because we've seen, again, people leveraging common, third-party identity providers or systems rather than rolling their own, because that's where you get into trouble, is with doing your own thing and the customization. Unless you're really skilled in this space, it's easy to make mistakes. Sufficient auditing. It's uncommon, I would say, to get really good security auditing at an application level. You might be able to get, quite a bit at the operating system level or network level, but for applications to do like application level logging that has security relevant data, that's pretty rare. And so this is something that we highlight quite often in terms of your applications really should audit all relevant user actions. They, you should ensure time clock is properly synchronized. That's more appropriate with IoT devices. And some of these other things here, but it's really around what happens if a security breach were to occur and you want to drill into things, perform forensics activities at this level. It's really going to make the job of those analysts much easier if they have this sort of log data. So that's something we stress, again, on the commercial product manufacturing side, is get that auditing data in place, because this is potentially will be really useful to your customers or to you should you have to investigate this. We're getting there. Mass parameter assignment. This is another one that has an interesting name. As a developer, this kind of makes sense, but if you're not familiar with coding, this will seem a little bit weird. But there are software frameworks that allow developers to automatically what we call bind HTTP request parameters. So you send a request. So on the left-hand side here, we're looking at HTML. This is just form data. So these are parameters. Someone fills out a form on a web application and clicks the submit button. It sends those fields, the data in those fields, to the backend. And the idea is that those parameters match up with some object-oriented representation of that data. In this case, it's a user object or a user class. What you'll notice if you look closely at this is we have user ID, password, and email, and then that submit button. But on the right-hand side, we have user ID, password, email, and then we have this isAdmin flag. It's a Boolean object meaning yes, no, true, false. But that's not represented on the form. What's interesting about these languages and because many of them do automatic parameter assignment, attackers armed with that knowledge can take advantage of that and add a field on the client side. In other words, they can kind of edit your website on the fly just within the browser, add the isAdmin parameter, set it to true, and then pass it back to the web server, and it will be automatically bound. It's not something that the developers expected would happen. They didn't think about someone doing this sort of approach. And unfortunately, it's the type of thing that a tool really can't find. It takes a bit of context to understand what does the back end look like, what does the front end look like, do they not necessarily match up, and could I take advantage of that as an attacker? Configuration. A lot of application security is controlled through configuration settings outside of the code. So we spend a time looking at code, which is really important, but the configuration with it, like environment configuration or host configuration, is really important as well. Excuse me. One thing I'll highlight with this area is we often see the same backend keys or passwords that are used in both test and production environments. And that's a big red flag for us. Again, when looking at things, we want to get as much context as possible. We will ask for anything the customer is willing to give us, whether that's developer documentation, customer documentation. We want to look at all the environments where possible so that we can compare things and say, okay, if what they're doing in this non-production environment happens to be sharing things that are done in the production environment, that introduces a weakness, because someone that potentially has access to either the development environment or configuration that goes into the development environment could leverage that knowledge to attack the production environment. So you can see your attack surface grows. It's not just your production environment that you have to worry about. You have to look at all the other environments that make up that also. Availability. We've been spending a lot of time this year on service availability. This is something that tools can often help with, but usually we see them working at a higher level. So at a network level, you have things in place to protect your network from abusive traffic, a large amount of traffic. But your applications might have specific weaknesses or systems, that and you can target those weaknesses more directly and not run into any sort of trouble at a network or firewall level. What we've noticed is we can often cause service outages by sending normal application traffic layer in an abnormal manner against a vulnerable endpoint. So we have to find a vulnerability of some type. Usually what this means is we identify an API endpoint that often is anonymous or maybe not, but it's it takes longer to perform than others, and that's usually a good sign that because that sort of request took a few seconds, we can exacerbate the problem by sending lots of data, well, relatively lots of data to that one endpoint, and cause a lot of activity to occur on the back end. So that's our biggest concern. Looking for targeted attacks where a small payload can create a large impact to system resources. We want to see that asynchronous nature. We send a little bit of traffic, it causes a big outage. If it's more or less one-to-one or linear, then that's something you can generally address through network traffic controls.
Okay, we're going to pause again to talk about CLE code number 2. Please record this code on your attorney affirmation form and send it to myself at lfrymark@foley.com following the program. CLE code number 2 is 0, X as in xylophone, Q as in quick, P as in Peter, V as in Victor. Again, that's 0, X as in xylophone, Q as in quick, P as in Peter, and V as in Victor.
Great. All right, let's move into this next section. Let's talk about some ways that things can be improved. We know that tools have their weaknesses, and the solution isn't always, well, let's just add more people and add the human element. Obviously, that's important, but there's more to it than that. So one, we talked about penetration testing. Obviously, my team spends a lot of time doing this, and the focus here is not just doing the vulnerability scanning, the automation, but having people, actual humans, spend some time looking at a system, whether that's an entire network or a particular system, an ERP installation, for example, and understanding where there might be weaknesses that can't be found via tool. So it's taking in all the results of various tools, sifting through them, and then trying out some different things to see how the system responds. Are there any configuration weaknesses or things that aren't being accounted for by the automation and so forth? A big part of this sort of analysis is the remediation option. So you've identified the problems, that's great, but more importantly, how do you fix them? So that's where we really want to see some value added to this sort of assessment is what are specific targeted recommendations that will help address the problems with the least amount of effort or cost. Layered defenses. This, of course, is important and applies to system in general, various systems in general. You can take a vulnerable or weak application and put it behind either an IDS, IPS, or web application firewall, or implement some form of runtime application self-protection, and that's good. Obviously, the best approach is to fix the problem at its core, but often that's not feasible or possible. So putting some sort of layer in front of it, or more than one layer, is generally a good approach, depending on the type of system. General network level systems, web application firewalls come in all shapes and sizes. RASP, this is a little bit newer of a technology. It's intended to have, again, kind of like IaaS, where it has its hooks into the application. Same thing with RASP. These sort of systems understand how web applications work, and they get installed right on, say, a web server, for example, kind of inject themselves right into that runtime process, so that if they do detect something on the fly, they can have certain rules to block it right at the application level. So when it actually executes on that server rather than a layer in front of it. So complementary, if you will, to like a WAF or IDS. Training. This is another area that's really helpful, especially for those teams that are designing systems or they're setting them up. Like I mentioned before, often software developers don't have a lot of cybersecurity training or cryptography training. They know how to build software. They know how to, meet requirements, meet deadlines, and so forth, assemble things. But security is often more of an afterthought or something they learn on the job. It's not treated quite as formally as it should, although things are getting better. We spent a bit of time performing instructor-led, classroom-style training, which all of these have their pros and cons, depending on the environment that you're in. These days, anything instructor-led is more often than not remote anyway. So all these great tools we have now for video conferencing and e-learning are really helpful to not only just communicate on a day-to-day, basis, but also providing that form of training. Hands-on labs, those are generally, very well liked, fairly practical for the more technical folks. They often we see greater knowledge retention in that sort of environment. And there's a number of, companies out there that provide, technical sort of cybersecurity focused training, as well as online like lab environments and training. What are they called? CTFs, capture the flag sort of systems and so forth. Unit and integration testing. This is more application focused, those teams that are developing software, but where tools, security tools might not be able to find problems. This is where you could code in specific tests into the system, or it's really more into the development, the build process of the system, where it compiles everything and has some form of automated testing, which is very, most systems these days have some form of unit and integration testing, which really just means automated testing that is executed usually somewhere around the time, either at the point when the software is built or shortly thereafter. And that's where security specific tests can be put in place. And so this is what we recommend in talking with engineering teams, software development teams, is you're going to be working on these unit tests and integration tests. Make sure you keep in mind security focused tests because about areas of the system or behavior of the system that is unique to this system. You have more context, more knowledge than an external or commercial security tool will have. So there are things that you can target that a tool will just not have specific knowledge of. I mentioned bug bounty programs early on. This is another complementary form of, or complementary way of addressing this particular concern. A bug bounty program it's a deal offered by many organizations. Individuals can receive recognition and compensation for reporting security bugs. I've seen these work really well, and I've also seen them work really poorly. So make sure that if you're considering going down this avenue, that you look at options and study, techniques that have worked well for either your peers or others in your industry. They generally work best for organizations that have achieved a more mature level of security practice. So if you're doing all the regular, foundational stuff, and you feel pretty good about testing that you may have in place or security controls that you have in place, that might be the opportunity at that point for you to consider something like a bug bounty program, where you can have outside parties look at your system, and again, you can decide what level of access they get or what sort of systems are in scope and all of that. One thing that is good to point out is that skilled bug bounty testers can almost always find weaknesses that tools would overlook. That's that manual component. They bring certain skill sets to the table. They have potentially more time, even more time than my team would have in a particular engagement. That's the one nice thing that I really like about bug bounty programs, especially if you have them that are long-lived. You allow people that can spend more time on things to potentially find weaknesses that we would never find or more likely not find in a shorter time frame. And then just better security testing in general. So if you work for a company or a firm that's doing security testing of any kind, or you participate in bug bounty programs, make sure you understand, where tools don't do as well, because usually, like many, especially in a bug bounty program, a lot of people are just going to run tools. So you can get a leg up if you understand what the tools are doing and what they don't do as well, and focus on the areas where they don't do as well. That's where your human expertise is going to come in very handy, as opposed to anyone that can run a tool and then work with the results. Also, if you happen to be in the space where you build security tools, clearly keep in mind there are areas where tools don't do as well. You may be able to, create some feature or some component of a tool or some whole new tool that is a differentiator just because, again, tools don't do so well. All tools have room for improvement. I get asked quite frequently, which tools do I recommend? And I usually have some answer that's like all of them. There are some that I wouldn't recommend, obviously, but it is often we see value in having a number of tools or working with a partner that works with a number of tools or multiple partners. It's very much not a one size fits all. So we didn't get a whole lot of questions. Wanted to kind of wrap things up with this conclusion slide with 3 key points. Cybersecurity testing validates your security controls. That's the what is security testing. Most applications and IoT devices have security flaws. At that application level, it is almost likely that there's some flaw in there. It might not be, so concerning that you have to drop the presses and stop the presses and go fix something right away, but it is just something to be aware of, that it's very common to find flaws. In fact, I can't think of any assessment my team has done where we didn't find something. Even for systems that we had looked at multiple times in the past and the team was fairly confident that we wouldn't find anything, we usually find something, even if it's, again, just kind of a low severity ways in which that system could be improved. And of course, be aware of areas where tools struggle and augment those with manual testing. You may have certain systems, for example, that just don't lend themselves well to automated testing. And that might be an area where you focus more of your manual testing internally or leveraging an outside firm.
So Bryce, thank you so much. I know we're going to come back to the Cybersecurity Summit slide, but I do have a question. If somebody's getting started, what are some quick wins? I mean, obviously, if you're dealing with PCI, credit card data, for those who don't know what that is, there's actual requirements on testing. But what if you're just getting started? Where would you recommend to start?
Yeah, if you're just getting started with testing and you're in a typical, organizational network, something of that nature, it may, so if it's in that sort of environment where you're looking at a, corporate environment, internal network, maybe some external, I would recommend tools that are specifically designed for that. So things like Tenable Nessus, Rapid7's, I'm forgetting the name now, but they're basically host and network level tools. They can be run by one individual. You run them on demand. You could schedule some scans. But the nice thing about those is they're almost universally valuable in any sort of environment. You have to spend a little bit of money on them, but they're generally more value, the lower cost compared to other systems. And almost every organization could use something like that. So if you're not doing any sort of vulnerability scanning today, that's the type of tool that I would recommend to start with. Yeah.
And then, if you're starting there, but, on an annual basis, if you had to pick 3 of them, or if you were not on a technical team, and you were talking to a technical team about what they're doing, so you sound smart, what are the typical testings that you would like to see that are basically, I would say, best practices other than where to start? So if you're going to the next level, like what would best practices on average be?
I would want to see, or I would recommend that you look for the results of web application security testing. That's often what it's referred to as. That's where they bring in their dynamic analysis tools. And I would ask, is it all automated testing? Is it just a tool that was run and you looked at the results, or was there any sort of manual analysis, manual testing that occurred? But yeah, so I mentioned the kind of host and network scanning as a core area I would start with. Web application security testing would be another one that's generally applicable to most organizations. everyone has web applications, and those types of tools are good at digging in deeper on those. For a third one, good question. I might look at your mobile applications. A lot of, most organizations use a combination of, commercial mobile applications or free mobile applications. And they don't have to be ones that you wrote yourself. Because mobile apps are put on public stores from Google and Apple, anyone could scan those, and you'd be surprised at how easy it is to take one of those apart and see how they're made and if there's anything bad inside of them. So if there are mobile apps that are core to your organization, it would be really good to scan the mobile apps, I would say.
Thank you so much. Again, here's the information here for the Cybersecurity Summit, which again, Tina and Syslogic have so graciously said they're going to donate money to our scholarship fund, which we very much appreciate. Please, anybody else that has any questions, whether they're technical or whether they come from the legal risk or compliance side. I have a question from Jerry that says, how can an organization ensure their mobile app has obscured code?
The short answer is you can only go so far to obscure it. That code will always be available in some form. Even if we have to get down to the assembly level, we can figure out what it does. You'll just slow us down if you add obfuscation. So I would go back and want to understand, why is the obfuscation there to begin with? Because anything that's in a mobile app, you should expect that an attacker can figure out what's there. With enough time, they can fully take it apart. They can lay out everything on a table, metaphorically, and figure out what's there. So what we don't want to see is anything like an encryption key or embedded credentials within that mobile app that's used to connect with a back end. Those are the types of things that we generally look for. If you're trying to obfuscate some sort of trade secret, then that kind of makes sense. Attackers are probably, I suppose corporate espionage folks are more interested in that. Attackers are less interested in trade secrets than they are, getting access to some other backend or whatnot. How can you ensure, if you use a good obfuscation sort of tool, it's not something you can generally apply after. Maybe there is, and I'm just not aware of one. Normally it's done at the point that the mobile application is created and packaged, as opposed to something you add on afterwards. But if you're creating your own mobile apps, you can certainly add a layer of obfuscation to them. Most mobile apps should not need obfuscation. Hopefully that answers your question.
Anybody else?
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Sure
Yes.
can.
Question on a different topic, but is any member of the MCSA here following along with for DoD contractors the CMMC standard that is still very much in flux and still very much being worked on, and DoD is now pushed back until the end of this year for releasing their final ruling on that, allegedly. But are members of this organization following that and providing guidance on that along the way, or will there be any specially tailored events towards that?
Sure. We actually did a session a few years back on 800-171 with SICICH, and then Foley did a session for our government contracting session, both on contractual DFARS requirements and the CMMC requirements. And Allison, I don't know if you or Lisa have that handy. We could always send it in the follow-up materials, but all of those webinars were recorded. We do a lot of work in the DoD space, and it is evolving. You're 100% correct. And yes, there isn't final. I mean, there's a lot of, outside auditors have become CMMC certified to do the audits. But yes, it's an evolving process. But we do have some materials available as soon as when the original, updates came out, I think it was November timeframe, we have many, several sessions you can listen to online, and we are following it. But I do think that would be a very good topic, maybe for the coming year, to revisit it again. We did it about a year and a half ago.
Gotcha. Yeah, no. Yeah, and the only reason I bring it up is, obviously there's a ton of resources out there, and until things are less in flux, it's always going to be a moving target. Hopefully they will be less in flux at some point, but it's always good to maybe get some more local help as far geographically. I'm based in Wisconsin, right outside of Madison right now, where our location is. And so always nice to speak with local people about that versus, might be very helpful, but across the country. So.
Most definitely. And I don't know if there's any other, IT outside third parties, that are really immersed in the DoD standards. I mean, we are definitely at Foley because we have a huge government contracting practice. So we advise clients on pass-through DFARS agreements, and then, related, CMMC requirements and, how you attest. We've also handled, unfortunately, a fair amount of DoD-related cybersecurity incidents, which have a different flavor. You have to report to the DoD, within 72 hours, either through DibNet or we do online forums. Plus, you have to report up through the prime contractors as well, which actually I think the DoD does a really good job of trying to gather information from you to anonymous threat share. So any of those of you who are in the DoD space, I would definitely recommend signing up for DibNet so that you can become aware of threat sharing data that comes through that. So, and Allison, I don't know if we can add it in right now. She probably doesn't have it on hand, but maybe we can include a link or something in our follow-up material so you have access to those Foley seminars, which do cover the CMMC process. It's not finalized, but in fair amount of detail.
I have access to the slide materials from that program. I think it was March 2019. So I'm going to share a link to those right here. The recording would likely be on the MCSA website, but I'll see if I can find a link to that as well.
No, that's the earlier one, Allison. Our Foley Government Affairs, Aaron Toomey's group, we did a session and we covered government contracting issues. We covered, what is CUI, what is other types of data from the national security perspective, and we covered CMMC in detail. And I know that they are videotaped, and we also have slide decks. And I think that was November time-ish of last year.
Okay, I found it right here.
And I know several vendors that are in that space. So, if you want to contact me via email, I'm happy to provide you some names.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so the link I just included goes to the webinar recording for that November program.
Yep, that is the one.
Robert, I noticed you had a question on code coverage in the chat. It's not really my area of expertise, but you asked any guidance on code coverage testing for web components that are delivered by open source. If they're open source and they're web components, my guess is they're probably JavaScript based or something where you have the code. So in that sense, a tool like SonarQube is where I would point people to and say that might be a good free open source way to start with doing code coverage on those components.
And what I was finding in some of the QA environments I've worked in is that they were only testing the components they executed, not what was actually embedded in the libraries. So right. I think it's a good thing to catch that you need to test the whole component that you're adding rather than just the components you're using.
One thing I've noticed too with the SCA tools, the open source scanning tools, there's at least two now that not only will identify vulnerable libraries that you're using, but they'll also attempt to see if you're using any of the vulnerable features of those libraries, because that can kind of be a sticky point sometimes where you're like, well, yes, you're using that library, but are you using any of the features of that library that have known issues in them? Because it's not always easy to just upgrade to a new version. So it's helpful to have that additional level of detail around is it that you're using not only a vulnerable library itself, but a vulnerable feature of that library.
Thank you.
Hey, Bryce, Aaron West. I've got a question about penetration testing when you go into a industrial facility. What's different about your approach for pen testing when you look at industrial control systems, OT networks?
Yeah, great question. So an industrial network or OT devices, we have to be very careful with them. And one of the main reasons is availability of those devices. They cannot go down for any reason. For example, if they're a production or a system that's being used on a manufacturing line, it's generally always hands off for any sort of automation until we understand what we're dealing with. So our approach is to kind of have those upfront discussions with, to the best of your knowledge, what is on the networks that we're going to be scanning. And we try and start in a phased approach where we go with a very light touch, doing asset discovery first. Let's just figure out everything we can that's out here. Then let's take it up a notch and target a portion of those systems a little bit deeper with certain types of tests. And we often will identify systems and then put them in different buckets. These are the ones where we can be more aggressive with. These are the ones where we have to be very careful with. Like some older printers, for example, you can really, cause some problems with. So we kind of have to set those aside and say, we're only going to do certain types of, automated scanning. Or maybe at some point we say there's no automation that's going to happen on these devices at all. It's only going to be very surgical manual analysis that occurs. So that's our typical approach.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Any other questions or exciting other events or any other topics you want to hear about? Well, thank you all. We obviously appreciate it so much, all of your involvement, covering all these sessions, is just a fabulous thing. And we look forward to seeing you on November 16th. If you would like to donate money, hopefully through your actual corporate organization, becoming a sponsor, please let us know. Scott had his information up, but at all times, obviously, you can contact me or Allison or Lisa. We can send that on. And we really look forward to our next session, really to talk about how you can forecast threats, particularized to your organization, even better. We may cover a few things about the SEC guidance as well. But at any time, please feel free to reach out to us. Let us know about exciting other events or topic ideas, or if you want to get more involved, please do so. And thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate it. And have a good evening. And here's his final contact information. Allison, in the next couple of days, our marketing team will be sending out a slide deck of the presentation with follow-up materials. And thank you so much, Bryce. Just a wonderful presentation. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Bryce. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Jen and Bryce.